It's India's moment. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to a special edition from New Delhi as a ballet of world leaders descends upon the Indian capital for the G20 summit that opens this Saturday. Never before in this era of globalization has India wielded this much clout on the world stage. Not in a long while has the world been so, in its international relations, so dysfunctional, to borrow the adjective used by the UN Secretary General. We'll hear more from Antonio Guterres later on. It's a ballet of world leaders coming at a time of heightened tensions. The presidents of China and Russia staying away from this G20. What can New Delhi do when it comes to issues like bridging differences on inequality, the planet's climate emergency, and those bitter rivalries? India, which is at times a part of those bitter rivalries. What future in this era of globalization for this country and for our planet? Now, as we see this ballet of world leaders arriving, there's already been one big bilateral meeting, and that is the U.S. President Joe Biden, first trip to India since he became president, who was welcomed by the host, Narendra Modi, sitting down with Biden. We'll have more on that later on why that matters, particularly in the context of those rivalries with China and Ukraine on the part of the U.S. and how India is playing it. India also courted on the world stage as it becomes the world's most populous nation and as its growth outshines those of the West and of China. Andrew Hillier has more.
Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has been jockeying to play a bigger role on the world stage. A democracy of 1.4 billion people, it rides on its credentials as the world's largest democracy. Modi has also pitched India as a potential counterweight to China. And as Beijing assumes an increasingly aggressive stance, New Delhi is positioning itself as a natural go-to partner for Western powers in Asia. Proof of India's rising global influence, Joe Biden rolling out the red carpet for Narendra Modi back in June. Modi was invited to give a speech to the US Congress, a rare privilege for a select few world leaders.
I can relate to the battles of patience, persuasion, and policy. But I am delighted to see you come together today to celebrate the bond between world's two great democracies, India and the United States.
Biden and Modi signed business and defense deals aimed at countering Beijing's growing influence. A month later, and Modi was being wooed again, this time by French President Emmanuel Macron. Narendra Modi got a front row seat at France's Bastille Day celebrations as the guest of honor. The two deepened defense ties, signing deals to sell New Delhi Rafale jets and submarines.
Today, we are going to continue to strengthen this historic relationship of trust between our two countries in order to face both international crises and major global challenges.
Friends,
the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine are being felt all over the world. We believe that the solution to all disputes should be through dialogue and diplomacy. India is ready to contribute to the restoration of peace.
Modi has struck a delicate balancing act on Ukraine, maintaining ties with both Russia and the West. While world leaders slammed Vladimir Putin and rolled out economic sanctions against Moscow, Modi has stuck to a policy of strategic neutrality. India continues to buy Russian oil at bargain prices. It's a move that's angered politicians in Western capitals, but it's boosted India's diplomatic clout on the world stage, making it a key partner for both sides in Russia's war in Ukraine.
So, in this G20 summit, all eyes on the host nation and on its prime minister. With us to talk about it, Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic affairs editor at the Hindu newspaper. Thank you so much for joining us here on France 24. You filed for the night.
That's right. I was able to.
What's your story in tomorrow's paper?
Well, the truth is that all eyes are really on not just the G20 summit, but whether there's going to be a declaration. That's important because no G20 summit so far has ended without a declaration.
It's a possibility?
The current declaration is still stuck as we speak over the issue of Ukraine. And it's an area where Russia and China are on one side, as you can imagine, and the G7 countries and the EU are on the other.
And Indians, when they see it being stuck on Ukraine, do they think, oh, this is the West's problem, not ours?
Well, I think the Indian Sherpa said it. He actually said, Ukraine is not our creation. Ukraine's resolution is not our responsibility, making the case that essentially, fine, Ukraine is an issue, we're discussing it, the impact not only of the conflict, but also the sanctions and all the economic impact on food, fuel, and fertilizers. But there are other issues that are troubling the world, particularly the developing world or what is called the global south. And those shouldn't be put by the wayside simply because you can't agree on Ukraine.
Because you can't agree on Ukraine. And I guess you could say there are the elephants not in the room, since China and Russia's presidents are not there.
Excuse me. It's not just the fact that Putin is not here. Putin has not gone to the last three G20 summits. But it's also the fact that Xi Jinping, who has gone to every G20 summit so far, even the one in Rome where COVID prevented him from traveling, he actually attended that virtually. So the fact that he hasn't come to India is significant. Some of it can be explained by, the bilateral tensions with India. And India and China are in a really bad place right now. But I think some of it does come from the fact that China has consistently said it doesn't approve of politicizing the G20 forum, which is an economic forum. And that's why China has been trying to block the declaration.
Or payback, because they're angry at the Indians over several issues?
Excuse me, there's some sort of... It's a smoky night over here. I think, yes, it is certainly true that while in Indonesia, China and Russia were willing to come to some kind of a compromise, agree to a certain language in the G20 declaration, they haven't made that same, or certainly China hasn't made that same adjustment for India.
Hasn't made that same adjustment for India. Let me ask you on a personal note. Suhasina, what is this G20 about?
Well, I think the G20 is an interesting moment for India because it comes, as you pointed out, when the world is in flux. And India stands there as a country that has so far taken a middle path. The idea that India can actually bring together the East and the West, the global North and the global South. Obviously, by rotation, every country gets its turn. And in 20 years, India has got its turn at the 18th number. So that's not surprising. But the fact that it comes at a time when India is actually the most populous country in the world, at a time when in the global economy, India actually does sound like it is a little steadier than the rest. And at a time when, frankly, China's stock in the world is going down. And India comes out in comparison.
Now, walking around the streets of New Delhi under security with travel restricted, a national holiday declared, and here where we are, we're inside that sector that's as big as 1/3 of Paris. It's huge. Right. And it's going to be difficult all weekend. But people taking it in stride, showing a lot of pride in the fact that the world is coming to Delhi.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to say...
Do you feel that pride?
I think it's an interesting moment. It's an interesting moment when everyone is talking about India, like your channel as well. And it is interesting to see how people are coming to understand that India doesn't have to stand on one side or another. It can have an opinion that people are suddenly giving a little more recognition to. I think as far as the lights and the glamour goes, these are conferences. They're over a weekend. The G20 declaration may not be looked at again for another year after, if it does come through. But somewhere there, it is a moment for India. I mean, I have to say that, it's not the first big conference India has ever held. 40 years ago, we had the entire non-aligned nations, 120 of them in India. We had the Commonwealth as well.
Yeah, the non-aligned movement was attempting to differentiate itself from at the time of the Cold War, the standoff between the U.S. and its allies and the Soviet Union. When you think back to the non-aligned movement that India really embraced and the G20, what it is today, what's changed?
Well, I think the idea of the G20 now, looking not at what I call the G10, which is the G7, EU, and Russia and China, which are the big powers that have held, in fact, the world all this time. And you look at the other 10 inside the G20, those are all developing countries. The ones that are coming in, like the African Union, also from the developing world. You see that the underpinnings of India's foreign policy, when it came to things like non-alignment, that was an idea. There are newer ideas of strategic autonomy. The idea of perhaps, if you look at even Ukraine, where at the UNGA, 140 countries actually voted against Russia, voted to criticize Russia, but only 40 countries have actually, and less than 40 countries have actually joined the sanctions against Russia. You realize that there's a whole world out there that really does say, look, we're looking at trying to struggle and develop ourselves. We don't want to take sides between the two countries. And that's the essence of what non-alignment was about.
Suhasini Haidar, you describe the model that India is selling, trying to bring together East, West, North, and South. It's at a time when, throughout the last decade, there's a trend. There's people testing democracies wherever they are.
Sure.
Many of the leaders attending this G20. Some have elections coming up, like in neighboring Bangladesh, and in your country as well in a few months' time.
Absolutely. And I think we have seen over the last decade a shift in democracies around the world, where you see not just democracy, but you see a kind of populist democracy that leads to single cult figures, or it leads to leaders who become more authoritarian, look a little more inwards, are a little more xenophobic. I think that's a trend we've seen in India and in Bangladesh as well. I think India's essential attraction for the world will always be because it is a plural, democratic, inclusive country. If it stops being any one of those, I think the world may like it less.
So when Narendra Modi sits down with Joe Biden, are they like-minded fellows in that respect?
I think you can say that India and the US share certain values, and they are democracies. They do have this young population that does see, themselves in a certain way that they share in common. Prime Minister Modi has had a very good relationship with former President Trump as well. He came out to public rallies together. So I think when it comes to leaders, they're essentially representing the aspirations of their country.
Representing the aspirations of their country? I mean, in the past, the US and India were not allies. Are they staunch allies now, since they're both in that security agreement called the Quad?
India doesn't do allies. It doesn't do alliances, and even the Quad is not a military construct yet. They do hold military exercises, but it's not a military construct just yet. So for the moment, I think India is as close to a strong strategic partnership with the West as it has ever been. And there you're right.
So once again, usually final communiques, people's eyes glaze over when they hear that word. You're saying it's kind of important this time.
Well, it's important only if it doesn't happen. If India becomes the exception in producing a declaration, that's not just something that will reflect on India. It reflects on the G20. Where does the G20 go from here? If geopolitical issues are going to hold it down like the UN Security Council is held down today, then what happens next year and the year after when other geopolitical issues show up?
Suhasini Haidar, many thanks for taking time out to come join us, Diplomatic Affairs Editor at The Hindu.
Thanks so much.
Now, we were talking about that sit-down that happened on the eve of the official opening of the summit. Joe Biden making his first trip to India as U.S. president. Biden, who at the same time was greeted at the airport with big fanfare. That sit-down ensued. They talked about contracts. They also talked about other issues such as strategic issues. We don't have yet the full readout of what was said between the two leaders. But again, it's interesting to hear back what Suhasini Haidar was saying. when it comes to the fact that India doesn't do allies. In this case, those ties have been warming for the past, you could say, nearly 15 years between the United States and Washington and India, be it through Democratic or Republican administrations. And with us to talk about it, a man who knows a thing or two about Washington, D.C., Dhruva Jaishankar. Thank you for joining us here on France 24. You are the executive director of the Observer Research Foundation, the America branch of it. Welcome.
Thank you.
So you're based, just to be clear, here or in...
No, I'm based in Washington, where I run an organization affiliated with the Observer Research Foundation, which is based here in India.
And so you get to see it from both sides?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
And it's been this meeting between Joe Biden and Narendra Modi. I'm going to ask you to play Washington correspondent here for a second.
Yeah.
If you're the President of the United States these days, is it about international geostrategic relations, or is it because, well, Biden also has an election coming up in 2024 and the Indian diaspora votes?
Well, I think it's for a number of reasons, but I think, if you're looking out at the world today from Washington's vantage point, and you see a lot of challenges, there is obviously a domestic political angle, but you have a global economy in turmoil. You're worried about inflation. You're worried about the war in Ukraine, about China as a peer competitor. And India, if you look out from that point of view, India emerges as a very important, possibly one of the most important partners for the United States. Today you have, closer U.S.-India cooperation on China because there's shared concerns about China's rise and security competition with China. India plays, they see a stabilizing role at international institutions. There's growing coordination between India and the U.S. at multilateral institutions. Economically, trade figures are up. Technological cooperation on a whole range of emerging technologies has really accelerated. And, if you look at the number of students, there are almost 150,000 Indian students in the United States. You take it all together, the largest number of startups in the United States, billion-dollar startups founded by immigrants, are immigrants from India. So you take all of that together, and India emerges as a very important partner for the U.S. today.
Because again, during the Cold War, the United States outfitted Pakistan's military, and
Yes.
the Soviet Union outfitted India's military.
Yes.
The way you describe it, is this just an inevitable development because of those family ties that you describe?
I think it's been a steady development, since 1998 when India undertook a series of nuclear tests. And that was in some ways plunged relations briefly to a very low point between India and the United States. Since then, there has been an effort by leaders of both major parties in both India and the U.S. to forge a closer partnership. And it's been steady progress, sometimes uneven progress. But you have seen steps. For example, a big step was the U.S. normalizing India's nuclear status, which happened between 2005 and 2008. But recently we've seen major steps on defense cooperation, including very recently when Prime Minister Modi went on a state visit to the U.S. So it has been largely bipartisan on both sides, but pretty steady progress.
Are you slightly surprised? I mean, we did see, remember Narendra Modi and Donald Trump campaigning together. There was promises when Joe Biden was elected in 2020 that he would call out democratic backsliding in India.
No, I mean, I think for India,
and since then, we saw at the White House, there was none of that talk.
No, for India, I think they look at, a relationship with the U.S. And I think the call was made, particularly after Trump's election, when much of the rest of the world said, let's explore options, let's maybe hedge against the U.S. India chose to deepen ties with the Trump administration. And a lot of that, including, for example, the restart of the Quad, sort of coalition, if you will, between India, the U.S., Japan, and Australia, started under Trump, restarted under Trump, has continued, has thrived under Biden. And then from the U.S. side, look, I think they see India as a complex country, which it is. So they see it's a very multifaceted and complex relationship.
Dhruva Jaishankar mentioning there the Quad, which is that association with Australia, the United Kingdom, and India and the United States. And of course, in the Indo-Pacific, the rivalry there is with China. China, whose President Xi Jinping is not attending. There hasn't been a real formal explanation, simply a message that's been repeated from Beijing as to why not Xi Jinping is going, or rather, that it doesn't seem to matter?
Firstly, China has always attached great importance to the G20 and actively participated in related activities. In preparation for the summit, the Chinese delegation also participated positively and constructively in the consultations and discussions on the document. We are ready to work with all parties to promote a positive outcome of the New Delhi summit on the basis of the principle of consensus.
So there we just heard the spokesperson at the Foreign Ministry asserting that China always plays ball at a G20. We're here to take part in it. We're here to bargain in good faith. We heard our previous speaker, Suhasini Haidar, wondering aloud whether there'll be a final communique. Is China the one holding things up?
Well, I think Suhasini mentioned what some of the challenges are. We'll see. I mean, I tend to be very hesitant about predicting outcomes. Things are being negotiated and often are negotiated.
Why is Xi Jinping not here?
We don't know the honest answer.
What's your gut feeling?
I think part of it has to do with the deterioration in China-India relations that we've seen over the past. It's been steady over the past few years, but particularly over the last 3 years. In 2020, China embarked upon a major military mobilization against India on the disputed boundary. There was a clash that led to the death of 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 or 5 Chinese soldiers. And so, since then, we've seen a number of steps. India has banned certain Chinese technologies, including apps such as TikTok. It has eliminated Chinese companies like Huawei from its 5G network. And there are today no direct flights between India and China. There are very few students in each other's countries. There's only one Indian journalist in China. There are no Chinese journalists in India. So, we've seen a sort of India-China relations in a very rocky state, and this could be partly a reflection of
How
that.
much of it is when we see factories either relocating or thinking about relocating from China to India?
So there's a little bit of that. It's easier said than done. There are a lot of sunk costs in China, but we're starting to see, for a variety of reasons, some of it has to do with China's domestic economic policies. Some of it has to do with trade wars, tariffs being applied by the U.S. Some of it has to do just simply with rising wages and economic factors. We're starting to see a lot of global companies looking at other markets, India being one of them, Southeast Asia, Mexico, others. So there is a fair amount of that. India has had some success so far in drawing electronics manufacturers into India, but we have yet to see that happen in many other sectors. We may see that in the coming years.
And yet, we see China and India together at other forums. We saw the leaders at the Shanghai Cooperation Forum, which is for Central Asian nations and this part of the region. Yes. We saw more recently at the BRICS summit. They were on the same stage, although not standing side by side. Is it odd? What's odder, having China and India together in the G20 or having China and India together in the BRICS?
Well, the G20 still makes sense because they're two of the largest economies in the world, and it makes sense that they should be represented, and the G20 is an appropriate forum for that. Most of these other organizations, if you look at them, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, either were initiated or thrived in a particular period of time immediately after the global financial crisis, where there was seen to be an opportunity for India and China to work together on some areas of commonality. But today, one could argue that those organizations aren't as effective as they could have been or should be. And mostly the two countries continue to engage in them because they each see a certain value. For India, being part of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is a way to engage constructively with the Central Asian republics. And sort of leaving that organization would not be, allow India that opportunity. So everybody sees a value in that. But I would argue that so BRICS, the SCO, don't have the same aren't as effective institutions as many of the other ones.
So the G20 matters. Dhruva Jaishankar, one final question. Which nation has changed more since COVID? Is it China or India?
Well, I can't argue about China. I've been to China, but not since the COVID pandemic. We did see China continue with a zero COVID policy for a much longer period. And we have seen some of the changes subsequent to that reopening. The economic rebound that I think a lot of planners in China had been hoping for has been much more tepid. In India, again, it's not as if just because of the state of the global economy, it may be not as growth rates haven't been as high as many would like, but it's still, India is growing much faster than most other G20 economies. There's a sense of optimism, there's a sense of openness. India's embarked upon a number of free trade negotiations again. So, if you look at it from that point of view...
I'll put the question to you differently.
Yeah.
Is China that's underperforming good news or bad news for India?
I think that remains to be seen. It does create an economic opportunity and perhaps a long-term economic opportunity. In that sense, it may be good news. On the other hand, I think the concerns, as there always are, about even a more insecure China acting out in various ways, and India being a neighbor and having a military competition with China, having to deal with the consequences of that. So, it would be a mixed bag.
Dhruva Javashankar, so many thanks for joining us here.
Thank you.
For this special edition. And how India navigates China is one issue. There, India and China, as Dhruva was saying, they're squarely rivals at this point in time. China, by the way, is represented by its prime minister. Russia is represented by its foreign minister. Sergei Lavrov will be here instead of Vladimir Putin, who is not attending. Sergei Lavrov, who made his first ever trip since Bangladesh became independent to Dhaka before flying here to Delhi. And there definitely is this us versus them mentality when you listen to the Kremlin's top diplomat.
I think if we analyze all that the United States and their allies are doing to promote their interests by using their so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, we will understand that obviously one of their main goals is to deter China and to isolate Russia in the region. But all of this is a part of a global NATO expansion process spearheaded by Washington.
To talk about whether or not the war in Ukraine is India's problem is Kavita Krishnan with us, prominent activist, and also the author of Fearless Freedom, which perhaps maybe we could talk just a little bit about a little bit later on, about the status of women, because that is a question that is pertinent for the entire globe. First, though, you penned an article just a couple of days ago where you denounced India's strategic neutrality. India, which poses the argument that for its development, it needs cheap energy at a time where prices are volatile, and therefore it will buy Russia's discounted oil and in exchange abstain when there are resolutions at the United Nations that denounce the invasion of Ukraine.
Well, what I wrote about was, and that applies at the G20, we know that Ukraine is a sticking point. The language of a resolution is a sticking point. What I have argued is that foreign policy, the so-called strategic autonomy, and domestic policy, which includes both ideology as well as the political economy here, they're related. And so the foreign policy decision, which the Modi government has made, has actually benefited two companies. One is a very close crony capitalist company of Modi's. Another one is a Russian state-owned company. So looking at that and at the actual benefits of this it's a graft scandal, basically. It's worth investigating as a graft scandal. That is my argument, basically.
The United States has leaned on many countries over skirting sanctions, over... in the case of India, though, you write, quote, that they're giving him a free pass. Why?
I think that the problem is that the U.S. Talks the talk of democracy, but essentially, whether it comes to Russia or India, but they have appeased Putin in the past. They are appeasing Modi now. And the sanctions, they themselves are participating in the bypassing of the sanctions by buying oil that is laundered by India, Russian oil that's laundered by India. And I think that, therefore, the concern for democracy in this world, this is not just about a remote issue of Ukraine with which the global south can just shrug its shoulders and say, so what? Nothing to do with us. It is to do with democracy in this world, which means that people in India, people in every country all over the world, and including in the global south especially, for them this matters. So we should be talking about, we can't just say aspirations of India are represented by Modi. No, India is divided, and Hindu supremacist aspirations are not shared by all of India.
But you take more exception to the opposition stance in your piece than you do to the government's. And I should just point out for our viewers, it's somewhat of a brave stance, since you used to be a cadre in the Communist Party of India.
Marxist-Leninist,
and Marxist-Leninist.
Yes.
And rather than go along with their position on the war in
Yes.
Ukraine, you decided to resign your post. How much of a minority position is it? How isolated do you feel?
I think that it is very isolated, and again, my criticism of the opposition is because I feel like the opposition is defending democracy here, and on many points very bravely so. But by giving the government a total free pass on this, on its foreign policy and its impact on the domestic policy here, I think that they are undermining that fight for democracy. And the reason is because what Narendra Modi is saying, even at the G20 to the world, is something, in spite of its competition with China, it's the same thing that Xi Jinping is saying, it's the same thing that Putin is saying, it's the same thing that even Trump is saying, or Le Pen or Orban, which is that the post-1945 global world order, in which there is a universal idea, universal standard of democracy, of human rights, that is dead. It's time it's dead, and we are all going to challenge it. And therefore, each of us can just define democracy in whichever way we want. And that means that the world is not about US versus Russia or US versus China and where India navigates that. It's rather about which democratic or anti-democratic forces in all these countries are working together. Which oil oligarchies in India, the Ambani company, in Russia, in China, all these, there are oil interests working here, in the US, of course, and they are, threatening the survival of the planet as well as of democracy in the world. We should start paying attention.
Which brings us back to what is the G20, because Kavita Krishnan, this was an organization founded in a crisis, the financial crisis of a decade ago. And when you think back to, it was a moment in time when the world had to come together, and it did. Now the world has to come together on things like climate emergency, inequality, and it's not. Why?
It's not, and it's
But
not
why,
even...
were they able to come together then and not now?
I think that the coming together then, that is a story, I think, which is a larger one. But I think that was a compulsion then, which affected markets then and so on, and governments felt the need to look as though they were responding. It's the same on climate change. They still want to look like they're responding. But my argument is that you can't look differently at geopolitics, at climate change, at the economy, and in internal democracy. And internal democracies are in danger, and the same forces, the same regimes that are undermining internal democracy, like in India, are the same ones that are pushing for undermining a world order in which certain standards of democracy are taken for granted. They are saying that those standards are all Western standards of Western elites. And, Trump is saying, even in America, the majority, it doesn't accept the idea of gender, of women's right to abortion or LGBT rights, transgender rights. And it's exactly the same language that is spoken by Putin. In India here, we are witness to the fact that women's hard-won rights, the right, a certain constitutional autonomy, all that is under attack.
All right, but let me play the devil's advocate here. The United Nations, it's a safe sport bashing the UN, but people feel globally an attachment to it, and people in all of the countries that you've mentioned.
Yes.
So there is this will of humanity to try to come together at a
Yes.
venue like this one and resolve issues.
that's what I mean, that I think the will of humanity and the will of these regimes that represent, that claim to represent those people, is not exactly the same. So people need to put much more pressure on their governments to say that you cannot be pandering to, potential autocracies. Like, Modi is an elected leader, sure. But he is someone who is representing Hindu. He wants to turn India into a Hindu supremacist nation where the Muslims are already facing violence and they are treated as second-rate citizens, and it's going to be non-citizens. So we should be paying attention instead of this is like pandering to the fascists in the last century.
One final question, your work, a lot of your work has been on bettering the lot of women,
Yes.
particularly after that rape case
Yes,
back in
yes.
2012, where you were one of the voices heard around the world on that issue. And when we talk about which model is the best one, you argue over the fact that people say it's got to be a trade-off between personal freedoms and security. And you say that's not necessarily what's the right answer?
It's not at all. In fact, it's a complete false framing of the issue. Autonomy for women actually makes the world safer, makes women safer. And the push in India is, to say in the name of safety, you shouldn't have the right to, we need to keep you safe, so we'll lock you up at home or we'll lock you up in women's hostels.
More and more women vote, by the way, and a lot of them vote for the BJP.
Yes, so I think that is one of the crises here. Absolutely, you're right, that many of the communities worst affected by the BJP, and that includes the oppressed castes, the indigenous peoples, as well as women. They are not realizing this danger yet because the Modi government speaks a language that is duplicitous, that is in a folk tongue. But in terms of policies, there is a very, they're undermining India's constitution and saying that instead of the individual rights being at the center, we're going to have this idea of village councils in which the community rights supersede it. So India is the mother of democracy, and democracy here means that caste councils will rule. That is something, women do not have a space on caste councils. And it is a very, very dangerous path that the government is treading. And what it is saying to the world is not only this talk about, we're a great democracy and so is the US. We should be paying greater attention when they say that India's foreign minister has a book, recent book, in which he has said this, that post-1945 global order, universal ideas of rights and democracy, all this is basically fading. And you're going to have a place where India, China, Russia, even, America under Trump or whatever, these are going to be able to say majority, white supremacy, Hindu supremacy, these are all basically democracy. And no one should have the right to question us on this.
All right, will it be going forward? Kavita Krishnan, I want to thank you so much for joining us here for this special edition. Will it be majority rule going forward when you look at the G20 nations? Is that what they agree upon? Or are there common values for the world over? Let's listen to the host, Narendra Modi, who's just come off the back of another summit. He attended the ASEAN, the grouping of Southeast Asian nations in Indonesia, arrived back to host the G20 in New Delhi. This is what he had to say.
21वीं सदी एशिया की सदी है, हम सबकी सदी.
The 21st century is the century of Asia and a century for all of us. For this, it is essential that we build a rules-based post-COVID world order and make collective efforts for the welfare of mankind to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. And amplifying the voice of the Global South is in our common interest.
हम सबके साझे हित है.
And we're here to talk about it with Divya Dwivedi. Let's try to take a bigger picture on this. You are Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Indian Institute of Technology. Thanks for being with us here on France 24. And we heard the Indian Prime Minister there tell the ASEAN nations that he wants a rules-based order for the globe. It's in everybody's interest. Your thoughts on the world getting smaller and what a G20 summit means in that context?
The world can get smaller according to the wishes and memories and policies of a very few people. But the world can also come together by, in fact, expanding and including more people who I think are not yet represented in the G20 in its current form. And in particular, with the Indian presidency of the G20, I think a very important a case in point is the inclusivity or the lack of inclusivity in India itself. So maybe we can start by asking the question, which is the India that is representing this colloque and is asking the world to come together? Which is the India represented in this head of the state.
Because the G20 says it represents 85% of the world's GDP, a huge portion of the population, and the ruling party in this country says that in the build-up to this summit, there have been conferences all around the country.
Well, that is the format of the G20. But exactly if we look at India itself, then there are two Indias. There is an India of the past, of the racialized caste order, which oppresses the majority population. It's well known as the intouchable, but also many other lower caste, les basses castes. And this is the India also of the Aryan interest, in quotes, which is now anxiously expressing itself in the Aryan name, Bharata. And then there is the India of the future, that is an egalitarian India, which would be without the caste oppressions and it would be without Hinduism. And that is the India that is not yet represented, but it is waiting, longing for the world to show its visage to the world.
Well, Divya Dwivedi, there has been a lot of growth over the past decade. It's been chaotic at times when there have been things like demonetization at one point, but we're speaking to one rickshaw driver who says he loves his lot in life. He's been doing it for 19 years. And 4 years ago, he was able to sign up with an app. And with that app, he does a lot more business. And he's more connected, not just to his customers, but to the whole world. Is there not the feeling that the future is smiling upon India?
If we go beyond the mediatized anecdotes, such as the one of the rickshaw puller, we should first keep in mind a kind of basic principle to understand Indian society and the split within Indian society, which is that India has been shaped over the past 3,000 years by the racialized order of caste, in which 10% of the upper castes are a minority, but they occupy 90% of the lucrative and powerful positions. That continues even today.
It continues in all the other countries, in all the other G20 countries?
I think if we take a world picture, then there are serious inequalities in not only the G20 countries and the countries not represented there, but these inequalities are growing even as the GDPs may be growing. And so I don't think that the GDP alone can be an indicator. But what about the 90% of Indian population, which over 3,000 years has been experiencing descent-based racialized oppression, exclusion, and even false or hoax representation in the form of Hindu religion? And that is the India that we now see emblematized, put forward even in this conference, right up to the colors of the logo, which represent the colors of the ruling party. That party itself has a parent organization, the RSS. It's not only a fascist organization, but it represents the upper caste supremacist interests of the minority of the country. So the question is, what would represent to democracy?
80% approval ratings, according to opinion polls, for the current prime minister.
Again, let's keep it in a perspective, against a perspective which most of the world has either ignored out of laziness or simply has not been allowed to track. And that is that the political ambitions of the 90% lower caste majority population of India have been in the works for 200 years. And there is a taboo in taking up these political ambitions, but they have remained the same since the past 200 years. And what are they? They are proportional representation according to the caste groupings, because caste is the way in which groups have been forced into slavery and oppression. And so that has to be inverted for true democracy to take place, and that cannot be represented in a few polls or in a few anecdotes.
I want to conclude, though, with a view on the planet and the words, let's listen to them, of the United Nations Secretary General after his arrival in Delhi.
Because if we are indeed one global family, we today resemble a rather dysfunctional one. Divisions are growing, tensions are flaring up, and trust is eroding, which together raise the spectre of fragmentation and ultimately confrontation.
So the G20, a dysfunctional family, says Antonio Guterres at this point in time, and the absence of those Chinese and Russian presidents, a manifestation of it. Final question for you. You're a philosopher. There's this idea of progress through human history. Is that a given?
It depends upon whose progress. Like I said, the upper caste minority has a vision of India which is now anxiously trying to assert in this name, this Aryan name of Bharat. And why is it anxious? Because the 90% majority in India, and I think elsewhere as well in its own ways, is asserting itself in the true sense of being progressive, that is, to have the progressive ideals of egalitarianism, of liberté, égalité, et fraternité, solidarité. And in India, therefore, you see the leadership often across parties and therefore across the decades since independence, but particularly in the present government, of a return to the world of magic, superstition, cow dung, oxes, all of which belong to a time where caste wasn't challenged, but it is being challenged now.
All right. The India's government, which states that that it's had a growth on its watch. So much more to talk about. I want to thank you so much, Divya Dwivedi, for being with us. We want to thank you. India's point of view, its Prime Minister's point of view. We'll be talking about it more with our coverage here from the G20 summit in New Delhi. Thanks for joining us.